Rule 1 of deep space hauling. If a human opens doors during a pirate boarding, you should start asking why. The freighter Meridian Drift groaned under stress, its aging hull ticking like a cooling engine as warning lights washed the corridor in slow, pulsing red, each flash revealing scuffed metal, loose wiring, and the faint shimmer of frost clinging to the seams where the temperature had dipped below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And somewhere behind that rhythm, something cut through the outer hatch with a precision that wasn't meant to be hidden. A deliberate sound, a message: we are coming, and we are not in a hurry. Ethan Cole stood alone at Junction C7, grease still drying on his hands from a routine repair that no longer mattered, his breath steady, his eyes tracking the ship's layout like a map etched into muscle memory. Every corridor width, every blind turn, every flickering panel he'd learned to ignore over the past 18 months hauling cargo nobody asked about and nobody inspected too closely. And when the first impact alarm chimed, soft, almost polite, he didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for the control panel and unlocked 3 internal bulkheads in sequence. Behind him, someone shouted his name over the comms. Confusion sharp, fear sharper, but Ethan didn't answer right away because he was listening, not to the alarms, not to the crew, but to the rhythm of boots that weren't human, heavier, spaced wider, confident in a way that came from never needing to be close to what you hunted. The outer hatch finally gave with a hiss that bled into the corridor like a held breath released, and silhouettes formed in the red light. Tall, armored, controlled, plasma rifles held low but ready, their movements smooth, efficient, built for distance, built for clear lines and open fields, not for the narrow throat of a freight ship designed by cost, not comfort. Ethan tilted his head slightly, almost curious, as if confirming a theory, then keyed another command, deeper in the system, something small, almost forgettable, a reroute that dimmed secondary lighting just a fraction more, turning shadows into something thicker, something that clung. Cargo crew. Remain where you are, came a voice over the ship's speakers, translated but still edged with something cold, something certain, and Ethan finally smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough to shift the tension in his jaw. He stepped back from the panel, boots soft against the metal deck, and moved down the corridor instead of away from it, deeper into the ship, deeper into the place where the walls narrowed and the ceiling dropped just enough to make taller beings adjust their posture without realizing it. And behind him, the pirates advanced, unhurried, unaware that the doors he'd opened weren't mistakes, they were invitations. And somewhere between the second and third pulse of red light, the Meridian Drift stopped feeling like a ship and started feeling like something else entirely, something that had been waiting a long time to be used this way again. The corridor narrowed by 3 inches every 20 feet, a design flaw on paper, a habit in practice, and Ethan Cole counted each step without looking, his boots finding the rhythm of the deck as the red emergency lights dipped and rose like a slow heartbeat. And behind him the air shifted with the presence of something larger, something armored, something certain it owned every space it entered, but certainty had weight, and weight made noise. And noise traveled in a ship like this, bouncing off steel ribs and empty cargo holds until it told a story to anyone who knew how to listen. Ethan reached another junction and did not slow, his fingers brushing a manual latch just long enough to disengage a secondary lock that most systems had forgotten even existed, and somewhere above him a ventilation fan stuttered, then changed pitch, pulling air in a direction it was never meant to go, subtle, almost nothing, but enough to carry sound away from him and toward them. Human crew, surrender is advised. The voice returned over the speakers, smoother now, more controlled, as if it had already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for the scene to match the script. And Ethan finally keyed his comm, his voice low, steady. Stay where you are, cut your lights, and do not answer anything that is not my voice. And for a moment there was only static, then a quiet acknowledgement, fear held tight behind discipline, and he nodded once to himself as if they could see it. He turned another corner and stepped into a maintenance passage barely wide enough for a single person, the ceiling low enough that even he had to dip his head slightly, and the red light did not reach this far, leaving only a faint gray wash from distant panels, and he paused there, not to hide, but to listen again, because the boots had changed, spacing tighter now, formation adjusting, learning, and that was good. That meant they were thinking, and thinking slowed you down. A soft metallic tap echoed from behind, then another, then silence. The kind of silence that was not empty but waiting, and Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the ship settle around him, feeling the temperature drop another few degrees as life support rerouted power. His doing, his choice, shaping the environment one small change at a time. He reached to his belt and checked the simple tools clipped there, nothing advanced, nothing impressive, just things that worked when you were close enough to use them. And his mind flickered, not to fear, but to memory, tight corridors, controlled breathing, instructors who spoke less and watched more, lessons that never made sense until space forced them to. The meridian drift was not fast, not armed, not important, but it was layered, patched, modified across decades, a maze of human decisions stacked on top of each other. And Ethan knew every wrong turn it could offer, every place where a step too wide or a movement too confident would betray you. And he realized, with a calm that surprised even him, that the pirates were not hunting him. Not really. They were following a path he had already chosen for them. He moved again, deeper, slower now, letting the distance collapse not in miles but in feet, then in inches, until the idea of space itself felt smaller, tighter, more personal, and somewhere behind him a voice, closer than before, spoke in a tone that carried less certainty and more calculation. The human is guiding us. And Ethan allowed himself the smallest shift of a smile as he reached the next control panel and dimmed the lights just a little more, not enough to blind, just enough to change how shadows moved, because by the time they understood what that meant, they would already be too close to change it. The ship felt smaller now, not in structure but in breadth, as if the meridian drift itself had begun to hold something in, waiting, and Ethan Cole slowed just enough to let that feeling settle into his bones. The faint hum of the engine's shifting pitch as auxiliary systems redistributed power in quiet compliance with commands no one else could see. And somewhere behind him the boots stopped again, not from confusion this time, but from realization, a pause that carried weight, as if the ones following him had begun to understand that distance was no longer their ally. The air moved differently here, cooler by a few degrees, drawn through maintenance ducts that whispered instead of roared. And Ethan adjusted his path by inches, choosing the narrower turn instead of the faster one, brushing past a wall where the paint had long since worn down to bare alloy, smooth from years of contact, human contact, habitual, repetitive, familiar in a way no outsider could replicate. You are altering the environment. The voice came again, closer now, no longer broadcast ship-wide but directed, intimate, and Ethan did not answer immediately, because answering would give shape to something that was still forming, and he preferred it unfinished, uncertain. He reached another panel, older than the rest, its interface mechanical rather than digital, and he pressed a sequence that required pressure, not precision, listening to the internal locks shift deep within the ship's spine, redirecting pathways, closing some, narrowing others, not sealing them, never sealing, just guiding, always guiding. A faint reflection caught his eye in the dim light, not clear enough to define, but enough to confirm proximity, and he exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, his pulse matching the ship's rhythm, one beat, one step, one decision at a time. Behind him, a different voice spoke, sharper, less composed. Why does he not run? And another answered, quieter, because he does not need to. And Ethan almost nodded at that, almost. He stepped into a cross-section where 3 corridors met, each one slightly different in width, in lighting, in sound, and he chose the one that bent out of sight the quickest, the one that forced anyone taller to angle their shoulders without realizing it. And as he moved, he reached up and brushed a conduit, loosening it just enough that it vibrated when touched, a soft, irregular sound that would echo unpredictably, scattering attention, fracturing focus. The lights dimmed again. Not fully, never fully, just enough that edges blurred and movement became suggestion rather than certainty. And Ethan stopped for the first time, not out of hesitation, but intention, letting the space behind him close, letting the distance shrink until it was no longer measured in feet, but in presence. The temperature dropped another degree, subtle, but noticeable, the kind of change that made breath visible in thin, fleeting traces, and he watched one drift across his vision. then vanish, and he knew they would see it too, would register it as data, as anomaly, as something to analyze. And that was the moment he was waiting for, the moment thinking overtook instinct. Human, the leader's voice came again, almost level with him now, no longer distant, no longer dominant. This is inefficient. And Ethan finally spoke, his voice low, calm, carried by the narrow corridor without effort. Only if you are still trying to fight from far away. And the words settled into the space between them like something physical, something that could not be ignored. And for the first time since the boarding began, the ship did not feel like a place to pass through. It felt like a place that decided who could leave. The corridor held the words long after Ethan stopped speaking, as if the ship itself understood them, absorbing the meaning into its narrow walls and low ceiling. And for a moment nothing moved, not forward, not back, just a shared awareness suspended in dim red light and shallow breath. And Ethan could feel it, the shift, subtle but undeniable, the moment when confidence began to fracture into calculation. A soft click echoed from behind him, not mechanical but deliberate, followed by the faint repositioning of armored weight against metal. And the leader's voice returned, quieter now, closer than before. You are attempting to control proximity. And Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the phrasing, then answered without turning, I am removing distance. And the difference settled heavily between them. The air continued to drift in unnatural patterns, guided by ducts and redirected flow, carrying small sounds in unexpected directions, a faint scrape that seemed farther than it was, a breath that appeared closer, and Ethan stepped forward again, slow, measured, letting each movement remain just within perception, never fully hidden, never fully revealed, because uncertainty did more work than speed ever could. He reached a service hatch embedded low in the wall and crouched briefly, not to enter, but to disengage a manual override that most systems no longer recognized. And somewhere deeper in the ship, a sequence of internal locks shifted by fractions of an inch, narrowing pathways, altering angles, transforming straight lines into subtle curves that demanded adjustment without announcing it. Behind him, one of the pirates moved, a single step too confident, armor brushing the wall with a dull, contained sound that echoed forward rather than back. And Ethan heard the immediate correction that followed, the restraint, the awareness, and he knew they were adapting, learning faster now, but still learning within a framework that expected space to behave in predictable ways. Your kind prefers open terrain, the leader said, not as a question but as an observation, and Ethan allowed himself a small breath that might have been a quiet laugh. Your kind prefers certainty, he replied, and then he reached the next junction and paused again, this time fully still, letting the distance close until it was no longer distance at all, but shared air. The temperature dipped another degree, enough that condensation formed briefly along the edges of exposed metal, softening outlines, blurring edges, and Ethan watched as the faintest outline of movement appeared in that haze behind him. Not clear, not defined, but present, and he did not turn, because turning would acknowledge position, would give shape to something that worked better without it. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance to the corridor's narrow geometry, one shoulder angled, one foot set back, a posture learned in spaces that did not forgive wide movements or wasted motion. And the ship responded around him, humming lower, lights dimming just a fraction more, until the difference between shadow and structure became a question rather than an answer. You believe this gives you advantage, the leader said, now within a few feet, voice steady but stripped of earlier certainty, and Ethan's response came softer, almost conversational. No, he said. I believe this removes yours. And for a brief second, no one moved, not because they could not, but because the space itself had changed the rules, and in that silence, the meridian drift was no longer a place to move through. It was a place that decided how movement happened, and Ethan Cole had already chosen the terms. The silence did not break, it stretched, thin and deliberate, until even the smallest movement felt amplified, and Ethan Cole let it stay that way, because silence in a confined space was not empty. It was pressure, it pressed against thought, against instinct, until something gave, and he waited to see which one it would be. The faint hum of the meridian drift shifted again, lower now, almost like a breath drawn in and held, and the red lights pulsed slower, dimmer, stretching shadows into longer shapes that clung to corners and edges as if reluctant to let go. Ethan did not move forward this time. He held his ground, feeling the presence behind him not as distance but as alignment, the way two currents met in a narrow channel and had no choice but to follow the same path. A soft adjustment of armor echoed, controlled, measured, and then the leader's voice came again, closer than ever, no longer filling the corridor but existing within it. You have reduced options, and Ethan's response came just as steady. So have you. And the words settled without challenge, because neither of them needed to prove it anymore. The air carried a faint metallic tang now, not sharp, not alarming, just present, a reminder of the ship's age, of systems layered and repaired over years, each one adding complexity, each one creating variables that could not be fully predicted by anything external. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not enough to signal movement, just enough to adjust balance, and his hand brushed the wall again, feeling the subtle vibration of a conduit he had loosened earlier, its irregular hum feeding false information into the space, scattering perception, making direction feel uncertain. Behind him, a second voice spoke, quieter, more cautious. "Commander, the environment is unstable." And for a fraction of a second, Ethan caught the absence of immediate response, the pause that spoke louder than any command, and he knew the leader was recalculating, not just the space, but the human within it. "You are one," the leader said finally, tone measured, stripped of earlier confidence. "We are many." And Ethan allowed a small breath, almost thoughtful. "Out there," he said, "that matters." And then he let the next words land softer, closer. "In here, it does not." The corridor seemed to tighten around that statement, not physically, but perceptually, as if the idea itself reshaped how the space was understood, and Ethan took a single step backward, slow, controlled, closing the final gap by inches rather than feet, removing what little separation remained without ever turning to face it directly. The temperature dipped again, enough that breath became briefly visible in the dim light. Faint clouds that formed and vanished in seconds, and Ethan watched one drift sideways, pulled by the altered airflow, and he knew they saw it too, saw how close it originated, how little space remained between hunter and hunted. "You are forcing convergence," the leader said, and this time there was no accusation in it, only recognition, and Ethan's answer was almost quiet enough to miss. "I am letting it happen." And for the first time since the boarding began, the difference between strategy and instinct disappeared entirely. The ship no longer felt like a structure of corridors and systems. It felt like a narrowing path with only one direction left, and Ethan stood at the point where that path ended, not as an obstacle, but as the final condition, and in that suspended moment, before anything else could shift, the meridian drift held them both in perfect proximity, where distance no longer protected anyone, and understanding came too late to change what had already been set in motion. The moment did not explode. It settled, heavy and inevitable, like pressure reaching a point where nothing more needed to be added, and Ethan Cole felt it in the way the ship stopped shifting around them, the hum stabilizing, the airflow holding steady, as if even the meridian drift understood that everything that could be adjusted had already been set. He did not turn, not yet, because turning would make it direct, and direct was not the point. The point was that there was no longer any direction left to choose. Behind him, the leader's presence was no longer distant or abstract. It was immediate, defined not by sight but by the absence of space, by the way the air no longer moved freely between them. "Human," the voice said, quieter than before, stripped of projection, almost contained. "You have engineered proximity." And Ethan let the words pass through him before answering, his tone even, almost reflective. "No," he said. "I just stopped preventing it." A faint shift followed, not forward, not back, just a redistribution of weight, and Ethan could sense the others behind their leader, no longer spread out, no longer controlling the corridor, compressed into the same narrowing line, their advantage reduced not by force, but by geometry, by design, by choice. The red light flickered once, then steadied, casting both of them into the same muted glow, no longer silhouettes, but forms sharing the same limited space, and Ethan finally turned, slowly, deliberately, not to confront, but to acknowledge, and for the first time the distance between them could be measured in inches rather than assumptions. The leader stood taller, broader, built for open engagement, armor designed for range and visibility, but here, in this corridor, that design had nowhere to expand, nowhere to breathe, and Ethan saw the subtle adjustments, the slight angle of the shoulders, the careful placement of each step, not out of confidence, but out of necessity. "You changed the rules," the leader said, not accusing, not even frustrated, simply stating what had become clear, and Ethan shook his head once, small, almost imperceptible. "No," he replied. "I used the ones you ignored." The ship responded to that stillness, not with sound, but with the absence of it, systems running just beneath perception, lights holding steady, air moving in controlled patterns, everything contained, everything close. Behind the leader, one of the others shifted again, a fraction too much, armor brushing the wall, and this time the sound did not scatter, it stayed, contained within the narrow space, and Ethan watched as the leader registered it, not as a threat, but as a limitation, a confirmation of what this environment demanded. "Your species prefers this," the leader said, and there was something new in the tone now, not admiration, not yet, but understanding beginning to form, and Ethan answered without hesitation, "We learned to survive in it." He did not raise his voice, did not move forward, did not need to, because the space itself had already done the work, had already brought them to the same point, the same distance, the same condition where range no longer mattered and reaction became everything. The air between them felt denser, not physically, but perceptually, every breath shared, every movement amplified, and Ethan held that moment, not rushing it, not forcing it, because this was the exact point he had been guiding them toward from the first unlocked door, the place where choice was reduced to presence. The leader inclined its head slightly, a motion that might have meant recalculation, might have meant recognition, and when it spoke again, the certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect. "Humans do not fear closeness." And Ethan's answer came just as calm, just as steady. "We understand it." And in that narrow corridor, under dim red light and controlled breath, the difference between those two ideas became the only thing that mattered. The corridor did not allow escalation. It demanded decision, and Ethan Cole could feel it in the way every system around them had settled into a steady, unchanging rhythm. The ship no longer adapting, no longer shifting, because there was nothing left to adjust, and that stillness carried a kind of finality that neither side could ignore. The leader remained in place, close enough now that even the smallest movement altered the shared space between them, and for a long moment, neither spoke, because words at this distance were no longer tools, they were acknowledgments. Ethan kept his posture relaxed, shoulders loose, breathing controlled, not because he was unafraid, but because fear in a space this tight had nowhere to go. It only amplified, and he had learned a long time ago that control was not about removing fear, it was about deciding where it lived. Behind the leader, the others held position, compressed into the corridor, their presence no longer expansive, no longer overwhelming. Just there, contained, and Ethan knew they could feel it too. The way their numbers no longer translated into advantage, the way their formation had been reduced to a line with no room to maneuver. "You guided us here," the leader said after a moment, and this time it was not a question, not even an accusation, just a recognition of sequence, and Ethan nodded once, small, deliberate. "You followed," he replied, and the distinction mattered more than either of them needed to explain. A faint vibration traveled through the wall beside him, the ship's systems holding steady under strain, and Ethan let his hand rest there for a second, feeling the structure, the thickness of metal between him and vacuum, between all of them and nothing, and it grounded him, reminded him that this was not open space, not a battlefield of distance and speed, but a contained environment where every action echoed, where every choice stayed. "Why not flee?" one of the others asked from behind. The voice edged with something uncertain, and Ethan did not turn to answer, his gaze remaining on the leader. "Because this is not the kind of place you win by leaving," he said, and The words carried a weight that settled into the corridor like the red light itself. The leader studied him for a moment, eyes adjusting to the dimness, to the closeness, to the unfamiliar lack of separation, and when it spoke again, the tone had shifted further, no longer probing, no longer testing, but considering. Your species creates environments like this intentionally. And Ethan allowed a faint exhale, almost a quiet acknowledgement. We survive in them first, he said. Then we learn to use them. The silence returned, but it was different now, not stretched thin, not waiting to break, but full, complete, as if the conclusion had already formed and both sides were simply standing inside it. The ship remained still around them, systems humming in low, controlled patterns, lights holding steady, air moving in measured currents, and in that contained space, something unspoken settled into place, something that did not need action to be understood. The leader inclined its head again, a fraction deeper this time, and when it spoke, the words were slower, deliberate. This proximity, it changes outcomes, and Ethan met that with the same calm he had held from the beginning. It reveals them, he said, and neither of them needed to add anything more, because at this distance, with no room left for miscalculation, the truth of the situation was no longer hidden behind technology or numbers or expectation. It was simply there, as close as breath, as unavoidable as the walls around them. The corridor did not change, but the meaning inside it did, settling into something neither side could undo. And Ethan Cole felt that shift in the way the air no longer carried tension but recognition, a quiet understanding that had replaced uncertainty. And for the first time since the breach, the meridian drift was no longer reacting. It was holding, steady and deliberate, as if it had already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for the final acknowledgement. The leader stood inches away, no longer advancing, no longer testing, its posture adjusted not for attack, but for balance, for coexistence within a space that refused excess, and Ethan matched that stillness, not mirroring, but aligning, because in a place this narrow, alignment was the only form of control left. We miscalculated, the leader said at last, the words unforced, almost measured against the walls themselves, and Ethan did not respond immediately, letting the statement settle, because admission carried weight here, more than any display of force ever could. Behind the leader, the others remained silent, their presence no longer pressing forward, no longer seeking advantage, just existing within the same confined geometry, and Ethan could sense the change in them as well, the way their movements had slowed, the way their attention had shifted from pursuit to awareness. A faint tremor ran through the deck beneath them, the ship adjusting internal loads, redistributing power, maintaining integrity under stress, and Ethan let his gaze drift briefly to the side, to the narrow strip of wall where the paint had worn thin over years of human contact. And he realized that this corridor, this exact stretch of metal, had never been designed for this moment, yet it held it perfectly. Your actions were deliberate from the beginning. The leader continued, not seeking confirmation, but assembling the pattern aloud, and Ethan gave a small nod, not as pride, not as defiance, just as truth. You entered, he said quietly. I adapted. The distinction lingered, simple, unavoidable, and the leader inclined its head once more, deeper this time, the motion slow, almost careful, as if acknowledging not just the human before it, but the environment that had reshaped everything they believed about engagement. The red light flickered once, then steadied again, bathing both of them in the same muted glow, erasing any illusion of separation, and in that shared light, the difference between them felt smaller, not because it had changed, but because the space no longer allowed it to dominate. There is no advantage here, one of the others said from behind, voice low, uncertain, and Ethan answered without turning, there is only what you understand, and the words carried a quiet finality that settled into the structure around them. The leader seemed to consider that, its stance, shifting slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to redistribute weight in a way that suggested decision rather than hesitation. And when it spoke again, the tone was no longer probing, no longer defensive, but resolved. We will withdraw, it said, and for a moment, the ship seemed to exhale, systems easing, airflow smoothing, as if the meridian drift itself recognized the shift. Ethan did not step aside immediately, did not break the alignment. Because even retreat in a space like this required understanding, required respect for the same constraints that had defined everything else. And after a brief pause, he moved just enough to create a path, not wide, not generous, but sufficient, a measured allowance within the corridor's limits. The leader passed without haste, without sudden movement, its presence brushing the edge of shared space before receding, followed by the others in controlled sequence, each step careful, each adjustment precise. And as they moved away, the distance returned slowly, inch by inch, until the corridor no longer held them in the same breath. Ethan remained where he was, listening to the diminishing rhythm of their departure, the gradual return of space, of separation. And when the final sound faded, he let out a slow breath he had been holding far longer than he realized. The meridian drift hummed around him, unchanged and yet entirely different, and in the quiet that followed, one thought settled clearly, steady and unshaken, that what had ended here was not a fight, but a misunderstanding corrected at the closest possible distance. The corridor widened by less than a foot, but it felt like an entire world returning, space unfolding inch by inch as the last echo of departing steps dissolved into the deeper structure of the meridian drift, and Ethan Cole remained where he stood, not out of caution, not out of doubt, but because movement after a moment like that required intention, and intention deserved time. The red lights steadied into a softer rhythm, no longer urgent, just present, casting the same worn walls in a quieter glow, and the hum of the ship rose slightly, systems rebalancing, airflow smoothing, temperature climbing back by a degree or two as life support resumed its standard patterns. He drew in a slow breath and let it out just as controlled, feeling the difference immediately. The way the air no longer carried the weight of another presence so close, the way distance had returned not as protection, but as option. His hand rested briefly against the wall again, fingertips tracing the familiar imperfections in the metal, the places where years of use had polished the surface smooth, and he allowed himself a small, almost invisible nod, not of victory, not even of relief, but of acknowledgement that the ship had held, that the decisions had aligned, that the outcome had matched the intent. The calm crackled softly in his ear, hesitant at first, then steadier. "Ethan, are they gone?" A voice asked, careful, as if speaking too loudly might undo something fragile, and Ethan lifted his hand from the wall and keyed the channel, his tone calm, grounded. "They are leaving," he said, not rushed, not dramatic, just true. And there was a pause on the other end, followed by a quiet exhale that carried more than words could. He stepped forward then, not deeper into the maze he had shaped, but back toward the broader sections of the ship, each step expanding the space around him, each turn restoring familiar proportions, and with every foot of distance, the meridian drift shifted again, no longer a narrowing path, but a working vessel, imperfect, worn, but steady. He passed the panel where he had first opened the internal doors, the controls still active, still responsive, and he reached out to reverse the sequence, closing what he had opened, resetting the pathways, not erasing what had happened, but restoring the ship to a state where choice belonged to its crew again. Somewhere beyond the hull, the faint signature of another vessel drifted away, engines low, trajectory adjusted, not fleeing, not chasing, just leaving, and Ethan did not watch it, did not track it, because what mattered had already occurred within the walls around him. As he moved, the lights brightened slightly, shadows receding, edges sharpening, and the ship felt larger now, not because it had changed, but because the pressure of shared proximity had lifted, and with it, the clarity of distance returned. He paused once more at a junction, looking down the corridor where everything had narrowed to inches, and for a moment, it looked like any other part of the ship, quiet, functional, unremarkable. And that was the point. That was always the point, that nothing about it needed to be extraordinary for it to matter. Why did they stop? The voice on the comm asked again, softer this time, and Ethan considered the question, not searching for something clever, not trying to explain more than necessary. And he answered in the same steady tone he had carried from the beginning. Because they came close enough to understand. And he let the words settle there, simple, complete. He resumed walking, the sound of his boots now the only rhythm in the corridor, steady and unhurried. And behind him, the The meridian drift continued on its course, unchanged in destination, but marked in a way no sensor would record, no log would fully capture, a moment where distance had been reduced to nothing, and in that space, something essential had been revealed. He did not look back again, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to prove, only the quiet, persistent truth that lingered in the metal and air alike, that in a galaxy built on range and reach, there were still places where everything came down to what happened when there was nowhere left to step away, and in those places, humans did not become something else. They simply became exactly what they had always been.